So it seems like, I don't know, just about every week now, it feels like there's another story of somebody walking away from their faith, or deconstructing their faith, or totally falling away in one way or another. And this is a very clear reality at this point, that there are many people who were very active in the Christian world, even to the point of being theologians, or leaders of worship groups, or pastors, or all sorts of other things, that individuals keep walking away. And it seems like it's gotten more public and even more common in just recent days, to the point that there's some books I know that being released kind of dealing with this question. So the question that this brings up then is just, why does this happen? Why is it that people keep walking away from the faith? Why is it that so many people who were seemingly very devoted to their faith, and even leaders in the Christian world, especially in evangelicalism in one way or another, why is it that they keep disappearing? And I've heard so many hot takes about this, and people want to have one particular reason or another as a cause, and I don't know that we can do that in such a simple way. But just to give some thoughts, I think thinking through a lot of these kind of stories and hearing a lot of these stories, there are some common threads that I've seen. So, when we are asking this question now, like, why is it that now it seems like this is so common, that there are so many people walking away so publicly, especially with, more recently, I think this last week, there have been two stories. A pretty major public Christian voice announced that he was no longer a Christian. And on I believe it was on Instagram and on TikTok, John Piper's son is, making quite a splash. And there have been news stories about him this last week and his critiques of Christianity and things like that. So this is why it's kind of on my mind, especially this week. And I know it is for a lot of other people as well. But some common themes, I think, show up here when we're asking this question: why is it that this is happening so often now? Now, the one, and I see people point this out a lot, is that the kind of evangelicalism that a lot of people were raised in was one that was very shallow and did not have the right answers, or many answers at all, not the right answers. And this is something that I certainly can relate to, having kind of grown up in broader evangelicalism when I was young, and just consuming the kind of Christian media and things that they made for kids, and the kind of things they made for teenagers as well, and things that were taught in youth group. It is the case that a lot of what was taught, especially throughout the 90s into the early 2000s as well, tended to be just very shallow. Didn't really give a lot of answers to the questions that we were really asking. To some extent, didn't really enjoy having questions at all. And when people ask questions, you were just kind of told, well, trust God, or these kind of pat answers that don't really help anybody when you're dealing with challenges. So I've seen that very much in the background of a lot of people falling away, is that they have just experienced a Christianity that doesn't really have any deep rootedness or any deep answers. Now, I think this is also the same reason why the new Calvinism became such a popular movement at one time, was because people in the kind of millennial generation, which I'm a part of, we had this kind of shallowness in our background, and needed something that was more deep, that had theological richness, that could give us answers to difficult questions. And for a lot of people, Calvinism did that. And so what we saw was a lot of people move into a Reformed church, or the Reformed tradition, because it was more rooted. Since then, I've done a video about this as well, why so many people left New Calvinism. Thinking through the people that I knew that were very much part of that movement, some of them have stayed Reformed, and those who have gotten much more confessional in their Reformed convictions than just kind of relying on the 5 points of Calvinism forever. But many of them have joined liturgical traditions, Anglican, Lutheran, Eastern Orthodox, or Roman Catholic, to find more historical rootedness, and I think deeper answers to a lot of questions, even especially deeper than you'd find in kind of New Calvinism, which gives a lot of answers to questions, but at the same time they're not always satisfactory, and also to some extent tries to answer too many questions in a way that there's no room for mystery left. And so I think a lot of people move on from that to more liturgical or historic traditions, even beyond that. And there are others, though, that I've known who were part of the New Calvinism movement that found those answers there and then walked away from the faith. And I think this has to be part of the story as well, that it does appear that so many of the people that I've seen, in publicly as well, that have walked away from the faith, the form of the faith that they last clung to was a very strict double predestinarian Calvinism. I think Dave Bazan was the first public figure that I remember making that point. And this also gets to something else that I've seen as a kind of common thread to a lot of these stories, is just the profound existential struggles, the struggles of reconciling the goodness of God and human suffering, and people not being content with the more strict Calvinistic answer, especially the kind of pat answers of, well, it was the will of God kind of stuff, which just, if whether true or not, does not really have it does not really give one the kind of existential answer that one is searching for when dealing with serious trauma and serious, psychological issues and all sorts of other things. So I think that certainly does seem to play a part in this picture as well. So we have the kind of shallowness of a lot of evangelicalism. It just doesn't have the answers to those questions. That seems to have played a role in this. And another thing is just the moralistic evangelicalism, certainly. And I see a lot of people mention this as well, that a lot of people who do fall away from the faith, when they express what the faith was for them, it does seem to be a kind of pure moralism. And you see that with, especially, I know Rhett and Link did that whole video where they talk about their falling away from the faith and why they left. And it does seem like there was this kind of moralism, this shallow moralism at the heart of it, so that there was no rootedness in Christ and in the gospel, but there appears to be just this follow the rules kind of approach to Christianity, and that's it. Which, again, that is very much part of what I was, raised with in many ways. Is that's the kind of material that was given to kids, the Veggie Tales kind of moral stories. Now, no offense to Veggie Tales, they're fun videos and everything like that, but the emphasis is just on, well, here's a nice moral, right? Like, you can be a David, you can do big things too, which is just, again, it plays into the kind of shallowness of it. And so beyond that, I think we also just have to be honest with the fact of our cultural situation right now. And I really, to be honest, in most of the apostasy that I've seen, this is probably the major factor, which is just the simple fact that Orthodox Christianity says that certain things are wrong and culture says they're right, and people want to engage in those things. I would say that, that's not the entirety of the story, but ultimately it largely is. When you do, as a Christian, face a culture that has a completely different set of standards and a completely different way of viewing life in reality, it is very hard to keep your Christian convictions in the midst of that, because our culture says that, what we desire to do, or what we inwardly desire to be, is really who we are. And that to be truly loving, you have to let people be their authentic selves, and their authentic selves is who they are in accord with their own kind of psychological states or their psychological desires, of what is called an expressive individualism. And that kind of ethic sets a completely different groundwork than the Christian ethic or Christian way of viewing other people or viewing yourself or viewing life. And that kind of expressive individualism does really stand behind everything that we consume every single day. It stands behind the way that people interact with one another. It stands behind the messaging in all popular media. It stands behind the things you see on YouTube. Everything is pushing a particular message. And when everything around you and everyone around you and all of the social pressure around you is all saying, hey, this is what you should think, and Christianity says something else, it is practically very difficult not to give in to that. And when everyone is telling you that you are mean and nasty for holding to, say, a particular perspective on gender or sexuality or whatever else it might be, those just tend to be kind of the hot button issues today. But when that's the only messaging you hear from the outside, it becomes extremely difficult to hold to what is a traditional biblical ethic. Now, what this also leads to for many is this whole idea of like deconstructing the faith. And this has become popular, especially among Gen Z, looking at Zoomers. It seems like it's the cool thing to do is to deconstruct your faith. And it kind of reminds me of just what we were doing with the emergent church when we were young and knew everything. So it's a similar thing where, you've got to kind of challenge everything and you have to deconstruct it. The deconstruction usually means that, at least in my experience, from what I've seen, and I don't want to say it's always the same, but from what I've seen, the deconstruction ends up being that all of a sudden Christianity looks a lot more like your culture and the particular ideology of your generation than it does anything else. So that, when you're talking about issues of sexuality, for example, and looking at the texts that deal with that, it does certainly appear that the driving factor behind a deconstruction of traditional ideas, it's certainly not exegetically driven. It's just not. The texts themselves are clear, and the ways that they have been, that exegesis of those texts has shifted in recent years is very clearly ideologically driven rather than the other way around. This is eisegesis, it's not exegesis. There's a reason why the church historically had always interpreted those texts in exactly the same way, because it's just what they say. But so I think that plays a large role in it as well. And the third thing that I do want to mention here, so we've got one is kind of the shallowness of evangelicalism and its kind of moralism as well, which kind of goes along with that. And then the second thing is just, hey, the culture says that we should be doing certain things and think about things certain ways, and it's really difficult to kind of hold the line on these things when the pressure is kind of mounting from all sides. When you don't have that pressure, it's very different. And by the way, Jesus, talks about this, where the parable of the seed and the sower, that there are going to be those pressures of the world, and many will fall away. Like this should not surprise us. In other words, that this is happening. It's disheartening. It's very sad. It's caused me a lot of emotional distress thinking through these things. But it is the reality of what we're facing. So the third thing is something that I believe is that we need to take very seriously, and that's something that I've unfortunately seen more and more often, is the realities of abuse in the church and abuse in people's experiences growing up, whether that's sexual abuse, physical abuse, all sorts of other things. It's very it seems like a very regular thing that, as I look at people's experiences as they're sharing them, we find people who are abused by a pastor, abused by a person in authority, or we see that a pastor supported husbands beating their wives and saying that this was okay, or all of these real kinds of horrific things that do cause real trauma, and it leads people to distrust the church, because it is true that when you see your religious leadership who are representing Christ in such a light, it, I think, is very difficult to view God differently. So I think that's something that we really need to take seriously, and we don't want to brush off. And I think what we don't want to do is say, to grab onto that kind of second reason people are falling away, which I mentioned, and just say, well, that's everybody. I think that there are real profound issues that people battle, and we have to care about people in those situations. We have to deal gently with people in those situations. And, to some degree, I can relate to this, and I've mentioned before, and maybe at some point I can talk about it more in depth. But my earliest memories of church are of a youth pastor making fun of me as a little child for not being good at sports, and being just like the awkward, weird kid. And I remember the pastor laughing while the other kids kind of like poked fun at me or whatever. That's like my memories of church as a child were in many ways pretty horrific. I've seen a lot of really weird stuff, and I don't want to like put myself out there and be like, oh yeah, my experience was as bad as someone who was like seriously, physically abused or something. But my point is, like, if I were going to base my faith on the leadership that I had in my life and how well they represented Christ, I may not be a Christian either. But thankfully I know that Christ is greater than his representatives often are. And I think what we really have to do in those kind of situations is to help people differentiate between who God is and who Christ is and what he's done for us, and the kind of abuse that they may have faced. But I think we got to be very careful and gentle and caring about how we deal with those issues. So these are just some of my thoughts as I've processed this and kind of thought through some of these things that keep happening publicly. And, I'd like to hear your thoughts in terms of what you think, what you've seen. But at least in my experience, it seems like those three things are the main points that I keep seeing in these kinds of stories. I'm sure this won't stop anytime soon, but we do have to be ready to answer these questions and pray for those who have walked away, knowing that God can bring people back from their wandering. So, well, I hope you enjoyed this, and we'll see you in the next video. If you haven't already, make sure to subscribe. We'll see you next time. God bless.